and Saha Al-Fifi and Josh Cooper. So that's going to be a very exciting day full of expert people who know far more about the topics in hand today than I do. But I am delighted to be able to lend the support of the Foreign Policy Centre to the work being done by Salam, Alkus, Diwan, Mواطن, and the day being organised by, with the tenacious assistance of my long-term friend and colleague Drury Dyke, and obviously the support of the Richardson Institute, who are long-term colleagues of FPC. So I'm delighted to welcome this knowledgeable and diverse group of people here today, both on the panels and you in the audience. And today is about trying to start to understand people's aspirations for the future of the Gulf, not just wish lists of those in power, but to provide an opportunity for grassroots activists and other experts who have worked in or on the region, who are able to speak clearly about the real challenges they face in relation to human rights and protections for minorities, the challenges around improving governance standards so that states are more accountable to their citizens, not just their elites, and the challenges around ensuring that more people have the chance to share in the dizzying scale of economic opportunities that are present in many Gulf states. And understanding the situation on the ground in the Gulf is hugely important for the UK as it considers its possible post-Brexit foreign policy. The Gulf states will provide a real test of the extent to which the UK's commitments to human rights norms and other values are going to be taken seriously when set alongside the pressure of potential trade opportunities. So without further ado, I will hand over to Yahya, who will say a few words, and then we'll go to a video. So,
thank you very much, Adam. Before we start, I will try to make the introduction very short to save the time because we're already running late. In the beginning, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you a lot for coming here. I will just highlight why we are here and what we are looking for, why we are organizing like these events and why we're inviting you, and why you spend time and efforts to support us, what we are looking for and what we need to achieve by this gathering. First of all, I believe every single person here, you are agree we have a major issue in the GCC countries and in the Middle East in general, but in GCC it's became clear at the moment. And the issue at the moment, we believe as human rights organizations or people working on the ground or experts working in this area, they believe the main issue is from the repression. And it's not about the people there. People there, they are really keen to have democracy and human rights and freedom of speech. They will love to enjoy the life like people they enjoy it here in Europe or in UK after Brexit. So people there, they are not like what the regimes told you. They are conservative and they don't want democracy and they are against the human rights. And they always try to, the regimes there, they always trying to use the culture and religion to justify their violations. So the people there, they are really keen to have their democracy and their human rights, and we are trying to support them and we are trying to go forward for that. But not everyone in the world keen to have the democracy and human rights values in our region as much as we came to have this. However, those people, especially decision makers around the world, who are the allies for Saudi regime and who are the protector for the Saudi regime and for the GCC's regimes in general. Sorry, I keep saying Saudi regime. We are talking about GCC in general. So the protector for those regimes there in the region, they are the Western allies because they want several things. They want the stability and they want oil, and there is lots of money in this region. And maybe some of them, they are supportive for democracy and human rights, but some of them, they never think about it and they just think about their interest. And their interest is with the money and oil and the stability in the region. However, the stability in the region at the moment, it's in high risk. And I'm sure all of you have been noticed what's going on in the region. There's lots of wars and there is lots of crisis, and from day to day it's going from wars to wars. And people, they are committing crimes and violations in the region. They keep going, they keep descending with these things, and they keep putting all the area in the high risk. After the Arab Spring, when people, they were very passionate about the human rights and they demand their rights, and we have seen people and they are protesting, having the same slogan, asking for freedom, asking for justice, asking for equality. And these basic rights, they should have it without going to the street to protest for it. But they went to the streets and they have been killed. And in our region, in GCC, when people went to the street in Bahrain, for example, they have been targeted by GCC's forces. And people, they have been killed in the streets just because they asked for their rights. And GCC's countries, they destroyed the democracy in Yemen. The revolution in Yemen, they destroyed it. And they keep interfering in every country they demand for the human rights and such of things. So by putting pressure on these regimes and these countries and those leaders from outside the country, this is something really important for us, because changing from inside is something so difficult. We have prisons which is full of human rights defenders, reformers. Most of them, they are behind the bars in our region at the moment. So, and we don't have any independent institutions. We don't have civil society institutions. We don't have any free media. So when we missed all of these elements, which is basic elements to try to challenge the violations and the repression, that means from inside is so difficult. And those regimes, they are not taking the legitimacy from inside. They take it from outside by their Western allies. We need to pressure those Western allies who give the pressure for these regimes by using the media, NGOs outside. As example, after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, lots of officials in the world, they don't want to see Mohammed bin Salman, not because they are angry from the crime, but because they know they will pay the price if they normalize the situation with him. David Cameron in the past, he said when they asked him why you support Saudi Arabia to be part in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and he answered, he said, because Saudi Arabia, they protected us from the terror, and they supported supporting UK in fighting terrorism. Where is terrorism now? Where is the terror now? Saudi Arabia, at the moment, they are inviting people to come to Saudi Arabia, and they are telling people Saudi Arabia is safe. And I believe it's safe. But in the past, they keep telling people it's not safe. So they are using lots of elements, terror, religion, culture, everything, to gain the support from the Western allies. Right now, if we, all of us, and experts, study centers, universities, media, NGOs, if all of us stop believing the narrative from the regimes in the region, stop blaming the people on the ground, because we can't judge people, they don't have their freedom of speech to express themselves. People, they completely silence. We can't say, no, people, they don't want democracy. We can't say that. We can't judge them, because they are under pressure, and they keep silence, and nobody allowed to speak unless if he's working with the regime. So by this conference, by this event, we need at the end, not just to understand the situation in the region, because I'm sure you understand what's going on in the region, but we need to pressure the media, the decision makers all around the world to stop supporting this regime and to stop even echo the regime's narrative. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for your participating.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Now, technology permitting, we are going to put on a short film by Mohammed Al-Fazri, who's the director of the Mواطن media platform, which he founded in Oman. So let's see if the tech works.
Why are we organizing this conference? Firstly, to draw attention to the most important issues in the Gulf for local and international communities. Secondly, to highlight the forces of change in the region which are helping to provide alternatives to the status quo. Thirdly, to stress the interdependence of external and internal forces of change and reform in the Gulf. The concept of citizenship is often thought of as complex, but it shouldn't be. It's a notion born out of social movement and political transformation. It lies at the intersection of what it means to be an individual and a member of society. Citizenship is about you recognizing my rights and responsibilities, and me recognizing your rights and responsibilities, and the recognition of our individual and collective rights before those in the authority. Citizenship requires, first, a legal basis which must regulate the relationship between the rulers and ruled. The social contract that intervenes law must balance the interests of individuals and the community. It must include provisions for public participation in governance. This is not available in any Gulf country. Gulf states are family-run, autocratic and authoritarian regimes in which nationals have few individual or collective rights. The national is not a citizen. For example, in the Omani status, the Omani Basic Law, the ruling family is called Al-Malika family, which means almost the owning family. Second, a socio-economic basis, which is aimed at satisfying the basic material needs of the community and introducing measures to help ensure equal opportunity. This is not the case in the Gulf states as well, where social justice doesn't exist in any sense. One only needs to look at Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. Oil resources in the country are owned by the royal family, who lives lavishly, while it's estimated that as high as 25% of persons in the country live below the poverty line. This is a running theme in the Gulf states, where wealth, privilege, and opportunity are denied to the masses and reserved for few. Third, a moral basis, which supports respect and, in the least, tolerance of opinion and dissent. It is this pillar which supports all others. This includes the notion that all persons are equal before the law, without any discrimination based on sex, religion, ethnicity, or political affiliation. While state narratives in the Gulf may have you believe they are tolerant, leadership in the Gulf is far from tolerant. As it stands, there is no room for difference of opinion or dissent in the Gulf. A fact we, in this room, know all too well. True citizenship is founded on the principle of equality, opportunity, and justice. It is these principles which allow societies to flourish. These principles are universal understood. The concept of citizenship shouldn't be culture specific. are the most significant obstacles against citizenship in the Gulf? In my view, the presence of oil in these countries is the most obvious obstacle to reform for several reasons. First, externally, the major world powers have common interests with the ruling families of the region. It is in their interest that the status quo continues. Domestically, the political economic system is based on the top-down distribution of oil revenues. The ruling families control state largesse, and with that largesse have built large security forces. And for a long time, the ruling families have been able to exclude nationals from participating in the governance. This modern history, which stems from control of oil wealth, has reduced the deterred the average person from being interested in the public affairs. Another obstacle to reform and mobilization in the region is the lack of awareness and exposure to different political ideologies, which is undoubtedly a result of the control of information by Gulf regimes. What is aspired future? It's a state centered around the principles of citizenship, a state which ensures security and safety of its citizens and works towards sustainable development. Though the Gulf regimes promises all these things, these are false promises. How many promises have these regimes made? Too many. How many visions these regimes unilaterally passed, but not even minimally enacted? How many nationals have been imprisoned or wars for calling for change? Far too many. How many voices have been stifled? And how many have been denied the right to participate in the governance and the future of their state? The answer is virtually all. A state centered around the principles of citizenship is a state which relies on participation of the people. We demand a state centered around the principles of citizenship, a state with participatory bodies and constitution created by and for the people.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I'm delighted to introduce James and Juliet to our panel. James is Associate Professor in International Relations and Middle East Studies at the University of Leeds, and as I said also before, Juliet is a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers, specialising in extradition, public law and public international law, and both are very experienced in the region and obviously have an interest in human rights and governance issues. I'll start with James, if that's okay. So we're talking about the Gulf as a whole today, but to what extent can we really group these countries together? So what are the sort of enduring social political features that they share?
That's a very good question. Usually, I suppose, it's common for us to view it as the GCC. And indeed, there's a growing kind of sense of collegial identity. And I think also the usual way in which we study these countries is through the prism of comparative politics. So by necessity, we've tended to group them together and perhaps not necessarily unpack them sufficiently to understand the differences between them. But that being said, and while there are clear differences in the histories, the population structures, identities of individual Gulf states. At the same time, we also see that there are clear commonalities in frameworks of governance, in structures of society, and in historical trajectories across those particular states. And I think there are basically kind of three broad things which bring those countries together in terms of their shared colonial experience under the UK, with the exception to some degree of Oman, which was never under formal British protection, of course. But we do see commonalities in terms of population structure and dynamics. We've also seen that they have a shared process of development and commonalities of development and economic structures, driven, of course, by the rentier state and the very nature of that rentier state and the way in which it functions. We've also seen that these are highly urbanised societies, and that urbanisation itself imposes certain disciplines and common structures. We should also recognise as well, of course, that these states gained independence and began their development processes at the same time during the 1960s and 70s, which of course is shaped by the wider discourses around modernisation theory and the ways in which modernity is expressed through things like car culture, for example. We also see that there's been significant social change and common patterns of social change across those Gulf states. They're all highly reliant upon expatriate labour. That expatriate labour causes political challenges, but also structures the way in which society functions. So even if you go to quite modest homes in the Gulf, you'll find that they often have maids as living in the houses of quite small houses. So that itself, I think, causes some commonalities across the region as well. In more recent times, we've also seen the rise of an increasingly educated population across those Gulf states, and particularly the rise of the role of women. We're very likely to see women becoming much more dominant in these societies, and that's common across all of those countries, I think. And finally, I think we also see that the ways in which those states, in a sense, kind of copy each other and follow similar patterns. The ways in which they market themselves to the wider world, the ways in which they engage in diplomatic practices, but also the ways in which they've all managed to some degree or another to embrace globalization while keeping out or trying to manage some of the more negative effects of globalization. And this process of kind of techno-modernism, as I call it, this kind of culture of you can solve pretty much any problem through the application of technology and lavish spending rather than necessarily going to the roots of the political causes of that particular problem.
Okay, no, that's a really useful overview of what brings the region together. So naturally, I will now segue on to the things that sort of drive them apart. So many of us here are familiar between the rift between Qatar on one hand and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain on the other. So can you try and unpack a little bit about where the dispute is currently, and also talk about what the roles of Kuwait or Oman are, and is there any significance to the new Kuwaiti head of the GCC, and basically where do you see this rift going, and sort of what role do you think us as outsiders can play in influencing those developments?
Yeah, important question, and there's been some interesting developments over the past week or so. The UAE, Bahrain and Saudi have all agreed to actually take part in the Gulf Cup in Qatar, which is clearly some kind of a signal of a thawing in the extremely tense relationship we've seen since the summer of 2017. I think to some degree you can classify some of these disputes as related to kind of traditional family tensions, but also competing foreign policies and some states not necessarily liking Qatar's entrepreneurialism, particularly during the Arab Spring. I think what we've also seen is that President Trump has stirred things up. He clearly, in a sense, gave this, at least the impression of a green light for action against Qatar and has rode back quite considerably upon it. I think you see Qatari-US relations having strengthened very considerably in the past year or so due to some quite clever positioning by the Al Thani family themselves. I think the Al Thani family have been able to not necessarily rise to the bait of the blockade. They've been able to leverage it quite well in terms of propaganda. They themselves have not placed any counter restrictions upon any of the blockading states, which gives them the upper hand. they've managed to find ways around the actual main implication of the blockade, with the exception of course, family reunions and those kinds of things. They'll be able to leverage that human rights discourse quite well, including the case at the International Court of Justice as well. So I think what we've seen, particularly in the past few weeks, and along with some of the attempts at mediation efforts, as well as some of the things surrounding relationships with Iran, some of these talks about potential kind of behind-the-scenes track 2 diplomacy, etc., going on, it seems like the blockading states wish to begin the process of de-escalation finally, since clearly the blockade hasn't had the desired effects.
Okay. We're also seeing unrest in Iraq and Lebanon at the moment, to a lesser degree, at a more political level in Kuwait, where the government resigned on Thursday. What do you see as the sort of chief sources of social and political tension in Gulf states, and how are they expressed by people, and what could be done differently?
Yeah, there's obviously a large number of tensions inside many of the Gulf states, but those are spread rather unevenly. Clear differences between Qatar and Oman, for example, mainly because of oil wealth. Clearly the fall in the oil price over the past couple of years and its more recent kind of stabilisation around the $60 barrel mark is definitely leaving budgets extremely stretched across the region. Most countries break even oil prices around the $80 to $90 mark. So clearly lots of deficits, lots of dipping into sovereign wealth funds, and also cutbacks. In the Omani case, for example, quite considerable cutbacks in government expenditure over the past few years, which hasn't necessarily been able to address some of the social tensions which have emerged due to disparities in wealth, land prices, property prices, etc., but also rising food prices as well.
Okay, no, that's brilliant. And just finally, can you sort of identify, obviously national security is a theme that is very important to the regimes and to the GCC in totality. And what do you understand the principal features of national security, both in terms of what they mean about it and what could be meant more broadly?
I think clearly national security has both internal and external dimensions, and that those two bleed into each other in quite complex ways across the region. I've just published an article, for example, back in September, looking at the role of the Iranian diaspora within the United Arab Emirates and the threat that they were perceived to pose to the state as some kind of potential fifth column. I did extensive fieldwork there a few years ago, and we very quickly discovered that actually most Iranians are simply trying to get by and pose no threat at all. They clearly feel deep prejudice against themselves, but rather than necessarily reacting to that through engaging in subversion of any kind, they've managed to reconfirm their old kind of Persian identity rather than an Islamist identity instead. And so I think that particular case shows that the regimes themselves are often perhaps rather paranoid about some of these internal and external security linkages, but that doesn't necessarily play out in reality on the ground. Clearly the Iranian threat is very much uppermost in the minds of most countries in the region, although both the Kuwaitis and the Omanis have much more positive relationships with Tehran, traditionally speaking, and have attempted to mediate in this wider sectarian-driven dispute. I don't think you see the language of sectarianism necessarily playing out when you speak to people in the region, but you do see a nationalism on the rise across the region as well, and that mobilisation of nationalist sentiment in many countries of the Gulf is quite visible and has been quite successful, but it also reinforces some of the internal tensions across the region. Very clearly, fears of the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood across the region, and deep paranoia about that, and sometimes it's not quite clear which is the most perceived to be the biggest security threat, whether that is the Brotherhood and that kind of Islamist subversion, or whether it's actually the Iranian threat from across the Gulf itself. But of course, with the campaign in Yemen, we've seen a great deal of tensions emerging, attacks on Saudi Arabia, and threats against Abu Dhabi in particular as well. So there are clear external security threats, along with, of course, continuing threats of terrorist activity in the region as well. So it's a multiplicity of threats, combined with, I think, to some degree, a lack of the kind of structures that the Gulf has got used to, with Trump not necessarily supporting the region in a way in which he used to. President Macron clearly attempting to fill that vacuum at the moment as well. And the UK also restaking its traditional claims to interest in the Gulf with its reopening of its naval base in Bahrain and stationing of permanent flotilla there.
Thank you so much for that. Can I turn to Juliet now, if that's okay? And it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about the work you've been engaged on in Saudi Arabia and the UAE or the other Gulf states. So what have you learned about the Gulf and its legal systems and about how they contrast with the procedures you follow in the UK? And how would you sort of characterise the legal conduct of the Gulf states?
Yeah, well, thank you first of all to the host organisations for all the work that's gone into today. In terms of my own work, my recent cases have largely focused on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and to a lesser extent Qatar and Iran as well. The two main areas in which I practice in this context are international human rights law and also extradition. And on the international human rights side, much of what I do is representing individuals who have been the victims of violations, usually arbitrary arrest and detention and torture, in international proceedings arising out of that treatment. And that, of course, has usually also gone hand in hand with some unfair judicial process that's complained of. So I've seen something of the administration of justice, particularly in the criminal sphere, in Gulf states. From that, and the other side of the international human rights work that I do is investigating and advising NGOs and victim groups on much wider scale patterns of human rights abuse. And a lot of that recently for me has focused on Saudi Arabia, and particularly the very worrying trends we have seen there in terms of widespread arbitrary arrest, suppression of dissent, discriminatory treatment of Shiite minority dissidents in the Eastern Province, and so on since 2017 in particular. And then, of course, on the extradition side, those are cases which are sort of governed by ad hoc requests from Gulf states to the UK. They're not governed by established long-standing treaty as such as our extradition relationship with other allies is, and the focus of those cases is somewhat more negative in a way for me, because that is really the aim there is to stop the client's extradition to circumstances where they may face ill treatment, where they may face unfair judicial processes. And so in those cases it's really a question of investigating everything that has gone wrong in the relevant states. One I was working on recently was the UAE, in order to put evidence of all of that before the UK court in order to halt that extradition. And in terms of the second part of your question, the contrast between, the judicial processes that I see from my work on Gulf countries and the processes I follow in the UK, to some extent, it's quite difficult to draw legitimate comparisons between the two sets of systems, because the common law legal tradition is very dissimilar to the legal tradition that is followed in the Gulf countries, which is closer to a civilian system, really. But I think the one area where you certainly can draw legitimate comparisons is in the area of due process, because that is a universal quantity, really. And there are two big distinctions, but which are of particular concern to me. The first is judicial independence. And the picture in terms of judicial independence is by no means uniform across the Gulf. And so in Saudi Arabia, for example, I think it's fair to say that there is no real sense at the moment in which the judicial authorities of KSA are meaningfully independent of the executive, and in particular the Ministry of Interior. One of the contexts in which we see this most sharply is in the context of the specialised criminal court, which is very much under the cosh of the Ministry of Interior. in administering Saudi's anti-terrorism laws, so-called. And in the UAE, for example, where I've also had a good deal of experience in judicial independence issues and the administration of justice, there have been some steps in recent years towards attempting to secure greater judicial independence. So in 2016, for example, a new law was brought in introducing judicial immunity, and responsibility for discipline and oversight was passed to the National Judicial Council. But there are still real problems that remain in terms of the de facto influence of the executive over the judiciary and over the National Judicial Council, which is notionally supposed to be independent. And the other area which I'd pick up on is closely related, actually, and that relates to the independence of lawyers and the ability of lawyers to function and carry out their job. To my mind, there is not yet any ingrained culture of respect for the right to legal assistance, and in particular, the right to privilege of lawyer-client communications. And in the common law system, the principle of lawyer-client confidentiality is absolutely sacrosanct. And the reason for that is not only that it presents a fundamental protection against human rights abuses, it's also because it facilitates openness with one's lawyer and therefore better legal advice, and therefore materially assists the court and the judicial authorities in getting at the right answer, which of course promotes legal certainty, that has knock-on effects for economic stability, and so on and so forth. And so there are real tangible benefits, I think, for Gulf countries in recognising the importance of lawyer-client communication, but particularly in the sphere of criminal justice. It's certainly not something that I routinely see.
Well, thank you. And I think you've partially started on answering my next question in terms of obviously, we're all aware of some of the more high-profile and shocking cases that have come out of the Gulf, from the Khashoggi case in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, pre-trial detention of women's rights activists and arbitrary arrest of activists in the UAE, the case of Nabil Rajab in Bahrain, obviously Rafi Badawi and others in Saudi Arabia. I'm sure everyone in this room has their own list that they could talk to. And every jurisdiction, of course, does have its miscarriages of justice, including here in the UK. But can you talk about how, why, and to what extent such cases in the Gulf may be quantitatively different, or qualitatively? Qualitatively,
yeah. I mean, well, the UK is by no means perfect.
Absolutely not.
No, certainly not. No country is. But I have to say, I do think there is a qualitative difference here, and it really is best illustrated by the wide-scale nature of some of the abuses that we see in GCC countries, but also the patterns of abuse and what we see some of those abuses being motivated by. So for example, in the UK, it is fair to say that there is an ingrained culture of respect for individual human rights and international human rights norms. We don't always get it right, but there is a sense of respect there. There are the structures in place to facilitate compliance and to facilitate accountability and redress when things go wrong. Where things go wrong, it tends to be the result of slips, mistakes. It is supposedly the exception rather than the norm. And what we see in certain Gulf countries, and I do have in mind here particularly Saudi Arabia over the last couple of years, are patterns of wide-scale, as I say, systemic abuses which are specifically directed towards suppressing dissent, undermining the position of human rights defenders, and that is qualitatively different. But the other qualitative difference, I think, is, as I say, this this difference between the structures that are in place in order to try and facilitate compliance with international human rights norms. And one example that comes to mind relates to the treatment of prisoners and the provision of medical treatment. So in the UK, for example, although it does sometimes happen that provision of medical care to inmates is negligent, inadequate, late, whatever, we have a system of things called prison service instructions, or PSIs, which go into granular detail about what is expected of prisons in caring for detainees. You know, so when you arrive at prison here, you have a medical visit on day 1. On day 2, a particular number of hours later, there is a second medical to pick up anything that's missed. There are instructions which govern in minute detail the mode and frequency of communication between a prisoner's GP and between the prison services in order to facilitate the provision of correct medication and up-to-date prescriptions, that sort of thing. And also instructions which govern ad hoc access to medical care. And in GCC states, those frameworks really don't exist. And so we see sometimes, on the one hand, access to medical treatment being used as a tool of oppression. And I'm thinking, for example, here of the appalling case of Alia Abdel Noor in the UAE, who was denied life-saving, or at least life-extending treatment for breast cancer and left to die in the most appalling circumstances. And more recently, a bit, not quite the focus of today, the case of President Morsi in Egypt. And on the other hand, we also see that even where the intention in individual cases is to facilitate access to medical care, because there aren't these structures in place, it's often chaotic, negligent, too late, and so on and so forth.
Very, very quickly, can I just ask you a little bit about what sort of scope is there for using legal tools here in the UK? Obviously, you talked a bit about extradition tools, but also global Magnitsky legislation in the UK context, the Criminal Finances Act and the Sanctions Anti-Money Laundering provisions. But basically, what can be done in the UK and other Western legal jurisdictions to help address violations in the Gulf?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, extradition is really, it's much more reactive.
Oh, no, absolutely. But I mean, that's a defensive mechanism, but more sort of proactive.
Global Magnitsky is a really, really interesting field at the moment. And as you say, you mentioned the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act in the UK. In terms of the Sanctions and Money Laundering Act, so for those of you in the room who don't know much about this bit of legislation, it was introduced last year, and it sets up basically the UK's sanctions regime. What it says is that we have to implement any UN-mandated sanctions, but it also sets up our own sanctions regime, our own ability to impose ad hoc discretionary sanctions on individuals who are suspected of corruption abroad, engaging in gross human rights violations abroad, and our own. So we can now, for example, introduce sanctions where we consider it appropriate to do so in the face of suspected serious human rights violations. So there is that flexibility there now to do that ourselves. Whether or not, and the extent to which the UK government actually acts on that lower threshold is anyone's guess. At the moment, the UK government has signalled that it doesn't intend to use that legislation more proactively than we have done in the past. And if I contrast that with Global Magnitsky, just quickly, that I think is a lot more promising, because that introduces the same kind of flexibility in terms of introducing sanctions. But we have, over the last couple of years, seen the US government being much more proactive than I suspect the UK government will be in levering those kind of sanctions against individuals specifically for serious human rights violations.
Thank you. We'll watch over the coming years to see how willing the UK is to enact these things, and similarly the use of unexplained wealth orders around probably large amounts of money that has been parked in the property market around here. Can I turn to Yahya now and ask, obviously, ALQIS is a London-based human rights organisations working on Saudi Arabia. And can you tell us a bit about how would you face arrest if you were doing the work you were doing here in Saudi Arabia? How safe do you feel in the UK? And can you tell us a little bit about your personal story and about some of the threats and challenges you've faced?
Okay, in Saudi Arabia, we have two institutions for human rights. One, they said it is belong to the government. The other one, they said it is independent organization. Both of them, they are belong to the government. In 2009, ACPRA, the Association for Human Rights, for Political and Human Rights, they sent a letter to the King Abdullah. They asked him to establish their organization. At the moment, every single person from ACPRA, they are in prison. And total years in prison for the ACPRA members exceeded 200 years in prison. My colleagues, my friend Walid Abul Khair, we worked together in Saudi Monitor for the Human Rights, and he sent as well in 2007 a letter to King Abdullah to establish and to announce his organization. He's the founder. And the letter transferred from the royal court to the interior minister, and they arrested Walid Abul Khair. He's sentenced at the moment for 15 years in prison. And one of his crimes that he tried to abuse the reputation for the government in the name of the human rights. So doing this work from inside the country, this is big crime. And at the moment, there is lots of people behind the bars just because they communicated with ALQIS and they transferred some information to ALQIS and they did some work for ALQIS, or they just tell their own story for ALQIS. So it is crime regarding to the anti-terror law in Saudi Arabia. It's a crime to try to pressure the Saudi regime to change any of the laws.
Yeah, that's a fairly clear answer to that challenge. Obviously, over the last year, there's been a lot of focus on the Khashoggi case. But what are some of the other cases that you've worked on? And obviously, you've very clearly answered the question about whether there are Saudi human rights defenders, so the official human rights defenders. But are there any other small groups that are able to make a difference on the ground in Saudi Arabia? And what does the cases that you're working on tell us about the rule of law in Saudi?
Okay, regarding to if there is anyone still working on the ground, all the human rights defenders, they announced their name, they are behind the bars now. Nobody still available at the moment. In the past, the Saudi regime, they tried to silence everyone. At the moment, they are not just trying to silence people, but they even try to take revenge from people, and they are trying to punish people, not just to silence them. Lots of people, they have been silenced for a long time, and they have been arrested, and they have been tortured. And the other question, what cases we are working in, I believe there's a case, it's worse than what's happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but what's happened to Jamal Khashoggi, it was under I can say under the watch from the Turkish government, and they published things about it. But the torture happened inside the Saudi prisons, and the sexual harassment, it's really something really worse than kill someone. To keep him alive, and completely destroy his life. At the moment, if I give you an example for Lujain Al-Hidlul, she's in prison just because she communicated with human rights organizations. And one of her crimes, she submitted a proposal for us to advise us to try to help people. They have been in prison, and after they left the prisons, they have psychological issue. And she told us about this psychological issue from people that she have seen in prisons. So she suggested to us to help those people, and this is one of her biggest crime at the moment. If I talk about Lujain, they not just destroyed the life for Lujain, they destroyed the life for her entire family. The family inside the country, her parents, they are not allowed to travel. They are in very difficult situation inside the country. Her brothers and sisters outside the country, you can notice that they spent all the time to try to get Lujain out of the prison. So they destroyed the life for entire families inside the country. But in the past, before the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, they were very good to hide and cover up their crimes. But after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, everything has become clear now. And I believe what's happened, the situation after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi must be different than the situation before.
Okay. Can I just draw you, and obviously we've touched on this already, but can I draw you to the sort of publicity around the reform process being carried out by MBS? Are there any areas where it's had a positive effect on advancing human rights in Saudi? And if yes, what are those areas? And obviously you've talked about some of the areas where things are going in the other direction, but be interested in your take on the gap between the rhetoric and reality.
Yeah. I remember there is an article written by the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Norway. She said MBS in the media is completely different than MBS on the ground. He's saying something, and he's really success with the PR, especially before the murder for Jamal Khashoggi. And he presented himself as the reformer and as the person who will support the women's rights. And we have seen here in London, unfortunately, we have seen lots of signs here when they welcomed him in London. And we have seen his pictures saying, this is the person who is going to bring the reform in Saudi Arabia. What's the source for that? It's just because he's saying that. But nobody asks what's going on the ground. The reform, the only thing that we can say it is something happened, they allow women to drive the car. And I think this is something is really basic. And we shouldn't ban the women from driving the car to allow her to drive, then to celebrate that. There's something not to celebrate it. When they allow women to drive, they should shame because they banned it already, and they allow women to drive and silently, not try to celebrate that. And later on, when they allow women to drive the car, they arrested all the women's rights activists and they tortured them, and they faced sexual harassment and lots of things and lots of violations inside prisons. So it looks like, okay, you forced us to allow women to drive, and we will take the revenge from you because you forced us to do that. If Mohammed bin Salman believed this is rights for the women, why he punished people they demand for this rights? And another reform, it's most of it in the media, but on the ground, all the reformers, they are behind the bars. And unfortunately, I heard from lots of officials and politicians in Europe, they said to me, we believe MBS, he learned the lesson after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi, and he will not do any mistakes later on. And I'm asking them, if he learned the lesson, where's the reform? They always keep repeating, it needs time. Free the prisoner of conscience doesn't need any time. It's just one decision. You arrested all of those people, just free them. This is the first step. Later on, we will start to think about believing you.
Thank you. And just finally, obviously you've talked about the sort of PR reach of Saudi Arabia, but obviously its influence is broader and, both incredibly far-reaching in terms of within the GCC and globally. And so how does Saudi influence the human rights situation in other Gulf countries, including particularly the situation in Yemen? Oh, sorry. Basically, sort of the reach of the Saudi influence, how does it affect the human rights situation in other Gulf countries, and particularly Yemen?
In Yemen, they hoped to have democracy, and they have revolution in the ground, and we have seen their demands. It's all the values for the human rights. Later on, we have seen the solution from GCC countries, And we have seen the interference from Saudi Arabia, and they are at the moment. What's happened after the interference from Saudi Arabia? What's happened after the war? They started the war, and it is now almost 4 years and 8 months. They destroyed everything in Yemen. They destroyed the hope of Yemen. And Yemen, at the moment, regarding to the UN, not regarding to myself, it's one of the worst humanitarian situation in the world. So it became, at the moment, worse than Syria, worse than Gaza, unfortunately. And this is from the hand from Saudi Arabia. And when they started that, they started the war, Mohammed bin Salman, he said to the world, they want to stop Iran in Yemen. Where is Iran now? And what's happened to al-Houthi troops at the moment? They are more powerful than any time before. And the Yemen has become more far from the democracy and from their hopes. And not just Yemen, in all of the region. They intervened in Bahrain and they destroyed their revolution. And even they intervened in Kuwait. And we have seen in Kuwait, we used to say in Kuwait is the best GCC country regarding to the democracy. And we have seen lots of people, they have been arrested in Kuwait and they have been sentenced in prison because they criticize Saudi Arabia. Or they stand with the Arab Spring, or they stand with the revolution in Bahrain or in Yemen. Because they criticize Saudi Arabia, they said al-Isa'a lil-dhat al-malakiyya fi Saudiya. So abusing the rulers in Saudi Arabia. This happened in Kuwait. So they interface everywhere, and they, as Juliet mentioned, and James, the dictator, they are unfortunately copy each other, and they are doing the same violations for each other. And countries like Al-Kuwait, they took some steps forward, but they have seen their allies and their friends and their neighbors doing the violations without paying any price, so they start to do the same.
Okay, thank you so much. We are, obviously, as you know, running behind because we started a bit late. So I'm afraid we're probably not going to have time for audience questions this time, but so if you've got any burning questions, save them up for the later panels because we've got some great experts who can answer them. But I just want to touch on two closing things for anyone on the panel if they want to answer them. Firstly, we're about to see a heavyweight World Championship fight taking place in Saudi. We've seen wrestling there recently. You've got F1 in Bahrain and the UAE. And yeah, it'd be interesting to know what you think about these international sporting events taking place there. Are they an opportunity to promote openness on the ground? Are they an opportunity for the international community to hold themselves to account? Or are they getting away with it being sports washing? And secondly, and then we can wrap up on this. So basically, if you want to give any final closing remarks on how you see the Gulf developing, and sort of what are the steps that can actually be taken to put them on the path of reform and advancement. So, and is there anything that we interested observers and experts can do to help? So if any of you wants to pick up on any of those closing issues, and then we can have a quick break.
Yeah, regarding to the sports things, it's part of the PR campaign, and they are trying to normalize the situation after the murder for Jamal Khashoggi. So if there is sanctions from businesses, from people to attend these things, if there is sanctions from Saudi Arabia, that will support to do pressure on the Saudi regime. And if the businesses and people, they took a part in these PR campaigns in the name of the sport or any other names, that will support the regime to continue the violations and to teach him how to cover up his violations.
Yeah, and just to pick up on the sports washing stuff myself, I certainly agree with and would reiterate Yaya's call for these type of events to be boycotted in effect, and to not be allowed to become the PR and propaganda drives that I think they really are. But beyond that, from a legal perspective, I'm not sure so much about opportunity, but they do present bodies that are involved with these types of events on the international front with a responsibility where, particularly in the context of sports, but we also see it with Dubai Expo 2020 and G20 in Riyadh, where these kind of events do happen. Those corporations and those sports regulatory bodies with some oversight of them or involvement in them, must adhere to their international responsibilities to make sure that violations do not occur in the context of those sporting events, and that there is accountability and that there is redress. You know, we see it in the context of Qatar and FIFA's shameful links with the kafala system and the way in which workers' rights have been ridden roughshod over in connection with preparations for World Cup 2020. And earlier this year, in the context of one of my own cases, that of Ali Ahmad, who is the young football fan from Wolverhampton, who attended the AFC football tournament in the UAE earlier this year to support Qatar. And in the context of that, he was targeted by the UAE authorities, we believe the Amn al-Dawla, detained and tortured merely for being a Qatari supporter. And now this is something that FIFA and its regional bodies like the AFC have to pick up on, have to investigate adequately in line with their own very clear policy and framework for doing so, and in line with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. There really is no excuse, and it's something which we're not currently seeing in that case from FIFA in any meaningful way. So yes, I do think that there is, if not an opportunity, then certainly a responsibility there for the relevant organisations.
Thank you. Any final thoughts before we...
On the sports washing, clearly I think there's PR, there's a degree of propaganda going on here, but I think they actually present a degree of opportunity because they draw such a spotlight on the region. And I think while there are clearly exceptions to that particular rule, the fact that so many sporting events are taking place in the Gulf now does draw that spotlight, does draw public attention, does force at least some kind of adherence to a wider normative narrative, and that wider normative narrative can then be leveraged against the regimes to ensure that they adhere to human rights standards more effectively. If the region is out of the public eye, then these kind of things can pass more easily. And I think the second and more important thing is that clearly these sporting events, along with wider focus on things like heritage, for example, museums, the internationalisation of knowledge, branch campuses of major Western universities opening the region, is part of the diversification campaign associated with things like Vision 2040 in Oman and Vision 2030 in other Gulf states. These are very important structural changes in the region which are going to be crucial. And I think some of the things that are contained within those documents, such as an increased focus on entrepreneurialism, is going to drive some significant social change in the region over the next 20 or 30 years. When individual citizens are taking responsibility for the creation of wealth, as tax systems start to come in, whether those are indirect such as VAT or increasingly more direct in terms of investment taxes, that is going to change some of the representation mechanisms and give citizens a greater voice. And I don't think that element of Vision 2040 and Vision 2030 contained within some of those documents is fully understood what the impacts of that are likely to be in the future.
Thanks so much. We unfortunately do. We can pick up on questions in future sessions and in the coffee breaks. No, I do understand that, but we are running behind due to a lot of technical challenges. Absolutely, I would suggest that we pick it up with people individually. Thank you so much. If people give their thanks in the traditional way, and we will get on to the next panel as soon as possible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.